Thanks for showing up. This is a talk that I've given quite a number of times over the years, but it tends to be spaced out and sometimes a lot of time in between. But it's always a fun thing to get myself refreshed on and do. It's a story. Arose out of a project that I got involved in quite a long time ago. And when I say quite a long time ago, this was 1980. But it still makes a good story. Now, what you're seeing here, the picture that's up on the screen is Theodore Gericault's Raft of the Medusa. And anybody who studied art history will know this painting. It's a very important painting in art history, and it's one of the treasures of the Louvre. It's an important piece. Many people I've found know the painting, but they don't know the history, don't know why this painting existed, what the story is behind the painting. And that's often the way it is the art lives on longer than the event. And one of the things I read, a quote was, "The painting then as now loomed larger than the event it represented." So something like this, a piece of art like this doesn't exist in isolation. And what I'm going to tell you is what's going on tonight is three different stories. The first is the history of what happened and why these people ended up on this raft like this, waving for help. The second part will be the story of the painting itself. Why did this painting get painted? And the third part will be our expedition in 1980 to go out and find the remains of the shipwreck. So since it's in three parts, a logical place is to break for questions at the end of each of the parts. So I'll do that. If somebody really has a burning question, speak up. I can't see you. But otherwise, I will plan to stop at the end of each of the three sections. And one of the things that getting involved in something like this and some of the other projects I've been involved in taught me is something about history that I never really picked up in school. I was not a history fan, and it seemed like a lot of dates, and this happened, and then that happened. And when you get involved in something like this, you realize that yes, the broad forces of the times and what's going on around the world matter, but a lot of events, a lot of really what happens comes down to people. It comes down to the actions and the choices of individuals. And history doesn't have to be the way it was. People make choices, and that influences the outcomes of events. So let's get going on the first part of the story of what the history of the shipwreck that led to these people on the raft and the painting. And we're going to start, if my slides advance. That's great. Okay, I guess I have to click. This is a painting of Napoleon. In this painting, he's victorious at Eylau in East Prussia in 1807. But as we all know, eventually Napoleon was defeated, his final defeat at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815. And the Medusa actually almost entered the story here. The Medusa was the fastest ship in the French Navy. And one of the plans before this final defeat was for Napoleon to hop on the Medusa and flee to America. And that didn't happen, and he ended up obviously losing at Waterloo and going into exile. But it was his final defeat at Waterloo that then set off the chain of events that led to the shipwreck. Now, in 1814, a lot of the powers in Europe held the Congress of Vienna. This is depicted here in a drawing by Jean-Baptiste Isbey. Talleyrand, other names that you're familiar with were here. And this was people getting together to say, okay, Napoleon's going to go eventually. What do we do? What happens to the map of Europe? What happens to the lands that he's conquered? When things go back, what is going back to the way it was pre-Napoleon? So, and this then after Waterloo, the plans that were set in motion here at the Congress of Vienna were then finalized. One of those things that happened was that the French would get back the colony of Saint Louis on the coast which is in Senegal on the west coast of Africa. So this had been a French colony that had been taken over by the British. And now, as a result of the transitions and the treaties, the French were going to get it back. So they put together a convoy of ships to go to Saint Louis and take over the colony peacefully, in a peaceful handover from the English. So the new government in force was the Royalists. They put together a group. If you're going to go to have a colony, you need administration, you need a governor, you need various folks in the administration, you need merchants, you need geographers, you need soldiers, you need farmers, you need families, everything you need to get to have a working colony. So they put this convoy, group of people together in a convoy of ships to take them down to Saint Louis, and right away, early on, things went wrong. This is Viscount Hugh de Roy de Chaumareix. He was given the command of the Medusa, which was the flagship of what was going to be this 4-ship convoy, and in charge of this group going down to Senegal. Now, de Chaumareix had been a naval lieutenant at the time of the Revolution. Because he was a royalist, he had fled France. He had been in England working in the customs department. He had not been to sea in 25 years. He had never commanded a ship ever, much less an important convoy. He got the position because he was politically connected. I know that doesn't happen anymore, but that kind of thing used to happen back then, that you got your position from political favoritism. But he was just not the right guy for the job. So the French put this group of ships together, and it was the flagship was the Medusa. And if anybody's got sharp eyes, and if you look behind the sails there, you'll see the American flag. So this is obviously not actually the Medusa, but it is close to what the Medusa would have looked like. And I'll come back to that later in the talk. So the convoy formed up at the Ile d'Aix on the west coast of France. There were various delays between weather, organization, everything else. And they got underway on June 17th, 1816, almost exactly 1 year after Waterloo. The Medusa was a 44-gun frigate, the finest ship in the French Navy, about 180 feet long, 40 feet beam, and about 20 feet draft. Because there were, and on the ship for this trip, there were going to be 400 people. So because they had not only the ship's crew, but also the various colonists and soldiers. So they were jam-packed. There were 400 people on the Medusa, 240 passengers, 160 crew. And just to make room for them, instead of carrying all 44 guns, and because there was no longer war going on, they only were carrying 14 cannon. And then with them, besides the Medusa, were a corvette, which is a fast vessel named the Echo. Then there were 2 slower ships, more troop ships, a flute, the Loire, and a brig, the Argus. And the idea of a convoy, in fact, the meaning of the word convoy means travel together. And that's the idea. So you travel as a group, there's safety in numbers. Right away, this broke down due to poor leadership. On board the Medusa was the new governor of the colony, a guy named Chamals, and his family. And he was like, we're in a hurry. We need to get down there. I don't want to make a long voyage. Let's just go. And de Chaumareix, being a weak character and subject to influence, took off. He just okay, let's go. And they put up all sail. And only the Echo could keep up. And the Argus and the Loire were being left behind. And it just was not well handled. When they were a few days out, they were watching dolphins swimming by, and a cabin boy fell overboard, and they threw over a buoy marker, and things were handled so badly that by the time they got the vessel stopped and they got a boat overboard, not only did they not find the cabin boy, they couldn't find the buoy. So right away, this was just a bad voyage. So let's look at what this voyage actually would comprise. Here's the, by the way, can you see this cursor now? Anybody?
I can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I just didn't know if this worked, putting the cursor. So I made a nice big cursor so you could see it. Since I'm pointing a laser at the screen wouldn't help anybody. So what you're doing is you're going from the west coast of France up here, and you've got to get down to the colony of Saint Louis on the west coast of Senegal. So that's the sailing challenge. Now, starting here, and the plan was, oh, I'm sorry, I had the slides for this. So getting down to there. Now, the recommended method was what's called latitude sailing. This was 1816. The chronometer, which was key to measuring longitude, was only invented by Harrison in the mid-1700s, but it was still not really commercialized. It was not widespread. So most vessels did not have a means of measuring longitude, which tells you where you are east-west. And but there's always, for thousands of years, people have been able to do a good job with latitude and know where you are north-south. And obviously, with a coast like this, it makes a big difference if you're, what your relative position east-west is. So what people would do is they would practice latitude sailing. They would sail out along a latitude. They'd go far enough that they would know that they were past all hazards, and then just go due south. You've got a compass, you can do that. You don't need to know your longitude, you just know you're not near anything. So you go due south until you're at the latitude that you want to be, in this case, Saint Louis in Senegal, and then you turn east and you come into the coast. So this is the way a lot of sailing was done to be safe, and this is what the Argus and the Loire, which were the slower vessels that got left behind, this is what they did. And so they went their merry, slow way, and they got to Saint Louis, and mostly you're not gonna, not entirely, but mostly you're not gonna hear about them again because their voyage was pretty uneventful. The Medusa, however, under the influence of Chamal, decided they wanted some fresh food, so they tried to go into the island of Madeira, and due to navigational and weather issues, they couldn't get in there. So they then went down to the Canary Islands. They did stop down there, and from there, they're very close to the coast. So they went along to sail along the coast. Now, this was something you were not supposed to do. It was not well mapped, and people knew there were lots of hazards. So the instructions for the voyage were, don't go down the coast. Uncharted reefs, shallows, tricky currents, all sorts of things. And of course, that is what the Medusa did. De Chaumery, bad as a seaman as he was himself, whoops. Was himself, turned over navigation of the ship to a fellow named Richefort, Antoine Richefort. Now, Antoine Richefort was not a mariner at all. His last 10 years had been spent in an English prison. He was a member of the Philosophical Society of the Cape Verde Islands, which are further south. He had been there before, and he figured he was the expert. For some reason, against the advice of his own officers, de Chaumery turned over navigational control to this guy Richefort. So here's what they're doing. They're from the Canary Islands. They're coming along the coast here, which is a dangerous area. So the sailing instructions said, look, don't do this. But if you do this, the biggest thing to watch out for is the Arguin Bank. And that's this area. You can see this is a topographical from Google Maps, but you can see it's a much shallower area that goes way off the shore, way off the shore. And this was a known major hazard, not well mapped, just stay away. This is a chart of Belin from 1765. This is what the Medusa would have had. And it shows that portion of the coast, and it shows this thing called Cap Blanc, the White Cape. And below that, it shows the Arguin Bank, and this big area just says shallow. This is all just sand and shallow, and just stay away from this. So the instructions said, look, don't go down the coast, but if you do go down the coast, make sure you see Cap Blanc so you have a reference and know where you are. And this is what Cap Blanc looks like from the sea. It's actually pretty distinctive. You've got this bluff of land, and then it ends. It just ends, and you can't see the shore because it's way back in that bay. So the instructions were saying, if you're down the coast, sight Cap Blanc. Once you sight Cap Blanc, turn west-southwest, this white line out to sea. Go 22 leagues, that's about 66 nautical miles, about 75 statute miles, 120 kilometers for those who work in that. So you go far enough, and then you can turn south-southeast, miss the bank, and get to Saint Louis. So that was what we were supposed to do. Well, what the Medusa did, of course, is that on the on the afternoon of July 1st, someone said that they had sighted Cap Blanc, looked off to sea and said, oh, there it is. I see it over there. Now, there were geographers on board. These guys were professionals. This is what they do, is they look at things, they travel, they map things, they look at things in the distance. And they said, no, that's just clouds over there. That's not Cap Blanc. But they, Richefort believed it, so this is what they did. So they turned west-southwest, but they turned too soon. They were too far north. So they did their 22 leagues, but then when you turn southwest, south-southeast, look what you're doing. You're heading right up onto the bank. On the night of night of July 1st, the Echo overtook the Medusa. The Echo, the fast ship that was still with her, realized that they were not doing the right thing. Came up along the Medusa, tried to attract their attention with signal lights in the night, and the Medusa ignored them. So the Echo went on their way, and they will come back into the story, but not as a shipwreck. So the Medusa made this turn too soon, and on the afternoon of July 2nd, mid-afternoon, a nice, beautiful, sunny day off the coast of Africa, they're heading in south-southwest, south-southeast. They started to see signs of shallow water. And when you're out on the water, when you're out in the deep blue sea, it's called that for a reason. It's got an appearance. You get to shallower water, the color of the water changes. You may see more fish. There may be some seaweed floating around. There are birds, which are signs of land being not that far away. And they came on, they did what's called coming on soundings. Now, when vessels are out at sea, you want to know there's enough water underneath. So vessels would periodically stop, and they would drop a lead line over. So this was a weighted line, and it usually had tallow at the bottom, so that if it did hit bottom, they'd know what kind of sediment was there. And if you went all the way to the bottom of this line, I don't know how long it was, but it was pretty deep. You're not on soundings because your line had not hit anything; it had not found any bottom. But when you start finding bottom, when that thing doesn't go all the way down, you're on soundings. So the Medusa was on soundings. So there were all these signs, and then people were cautioning them, and they slowed down a little bit, but they didn't turn. They just took half measures, and this thing of half measures really just characterizes this whole disaster. So as they're coming in, they're sailing in, and they hit the bottom, and they bumped over. They were free, and then they hit again, and then they came to rest. Nice, beautiful afternoon of July 2nd. Now, sailors, mariners in general, have a saying that when the draft of your vessel exceeds the depth of the water, you are most assuredly aground. And that sounds very funny. And I've been aground myself in my own sailboat once upon a time. But there's actually a lot of wisdom in that, because it tells you what to do to not be aground. One is to increase the depth. Well, there's a couple ways to increase the depth. One is to send out small boats, which they did, and take measurements to find out where's deep water around me, and then put out what's called a kedge anchor. You take an anchor out with a small boat, you put it in the bottom, and you pull yourself against that to drag yourself over. And they tried that. They found when they did this, by the way, that the only way out of where they were was in the way they had come. They had sailed into a cul-de-sac. So they tried doing this, but they got it, the ship only turned around a little bit, and they got it to move a little bit, but then it just bumped again. It was really aground. Now, another way to increase your depth is to wait. So the ideal thing is to have the foresight to go aground at low tide. And then what you do is you wait for the tide to come in, and you make a cup of tea, you do whatever, and it lifts you up, and then you go your merry way. Well, the problem was the Medusa went aground at high tide. And not only did they go aground at high tide, they went aground at what's called spring high tide, when the moon and the sun are aligned, so you get the highest tides of the month. So the water was not going to be deeper by itself for another month. And meanwhile, they're deathly afraid that storms are going to come in, that the ship is going to break up at any minute. They have to get off. So they weren't able to increase the depth. The other thing to do is to decrease your draft, meaning ride higher in the water. And the way you do that is you make the ship lighter. So you throw things overboard. Now, in a distress like this, you should take the obvious heavy thing like the cannons and throw them overboard. But they didn't do that. Chamals and the Chaumeray, oh no, this is too ignominious to come into the colony with all our guns gone. So what they did is they piled the cannons on the bow to try to tilt the vessel, to get the stern off, to get the keel off the bottom a little bit. You could throw things overboard. What they did is they took down a lot of the upper spars of the ship and tied them alongside. That's wood, it'll just float. You can just put it all back together afterwards. That's why ships have carpenters. They also had a lot of flour for the colony, barrels and barrels and barrels of flour. They could have tossed those overboard. The outer part of the flour would have gotten wet, but you could have recovered it, but they didn't do it. Again, they didn't want to risk losing it. Half measures, and in the end, they just didn't get anywhere. And on the night of July 3rd, a storm did come in, and the ship pounded on the bottom, and the keel broke. And once that happened, this ship was not going anywhere ever. So now, what do? Again, they were afraid that the ship was going to break up at any moment. Now, you want to get people off the ship. You want to get them ashore. There had been a book published, and it had been widely circulated in Europe by somebody who had been captured by the desert inhabitants, and it was a very lurid tale of being a slave and being treated badly. So everybody was worried about that. So the idea was to get all 400 people ashore together, so that they would have a nice, fighting force. They had soldiers, they had arms, and they would, present a united front and have a strong force on the shore. So they were arranged for a departure on July 5th. And now, how do you get off the vessel? Now, this is 1816. The Titanic was just about 100 years later, and we all know the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. The Medusa surely did not have enough lifeboats to carry all 400 people. There's no way the ship's boats were going to carry everybody, and hence we get the Raft of the Medusa. And this is a drawing that was actually made by the ship's carpenter, so it's probably a decent rendition. So the ship was made up of wood that was on board. The vessel was made of spars, the things that the sails are on. You can see some of those shapes, like here, where this would have been on the mast. And this was 7 by 20 meters. That's about 23 feet by 66 feet. So it sounds like a decent size object, but not when you put 150 people on it, which is how many they had to put on it because there wasn't enough room in the boats. Now, another thing that looks reassuring is you can see that this raft has a pointy end, and generally, boats go in the direction of the pointy end, which is the bow. But if you get a flat piece of wood and you just carve a pointy end on one way, that doesn't make it go that way. You have to have a keel. You have to have something that's going to steer it. So just putting a pointy end on a flat piece of wood is just wishful thinking. So, but they weren't planning to sail this. The plan was for everybody to stay together. There were 6 boats. So load those up as much as you could, have them all get tied up one after another, and tow the raft. So everybody would stay together. That was the plan. So they were getting as many people as they could on these boats, and then 150 people on the raft, which by the time they got the 150, the raft itself was underwater. People were, like knee deep or more in the water, just because there's so many people on this structure. A lot of soldiers were put on there. A few of the professional sailors, the officers from the ship, some civilians, geographers, doctor. And because they had planned to stay together and go straight to shore, there were very little provisions on board because there wasn't thought to be a need for that. So there was, of course, this being a French raft, there was wine. You can't sail a raft without that. There were some biscuits, but there were not a lot of provisions. So this is a contemporary drawing uh, that sort of depicting the scene at the shipwreck at this time of the departure. So here you've got these 6 boats. 4 of them were very overloaded, and 2 of them, the ones, of course, that carried the captain and carried the governor, were less heavily loaded, coincidentally. And then there's the 150 people on the raft. And they actually ended up leaving 17 people on board the wreck. Some of them just plain refused to get on the raft. They just saw what a crazy thing that was, and nobody was letting them into the boats. So they ended up being left on board. And this is not something a captain is supposed to do, is leave people behind on a vessel. So that's already a big problem for de Chaumareix. So the 2 boats. So the plan started out. They tried to execute it. So they had a boat, with it connected to the raft with a rope, and they had another boat in front of that, and they had 4 of the boats formed up in a row. And one of the other boats was coming in to join the line, and just came in wrong and was heading towards the line, the middle of the line of the boats. And so they cast loose lines, to connecting them so that they wouldn't get all tangled up. And just in this confusion, according to the accounts, and according to the accounts of Chamal, the governor gave the order to let loose the raft. So they abandoned the raft, and this was after they had gotten a couple miles from the Medusa. They had already started towing it. They were a couple miles from the shipwreck, and this got fouled up, and they let go of the raft. And originally the people on the raft were cheering because they thought, oh, the only reason they do that is the land must be closer than we thought. We're all saved. Only to then see the boats disappear into the distance. So the 2 boats that had de Chaumareix and Chamal's, the captain and the governor, sailed directly to Saint Louis in Senegal, and they got there in 3 days on July 8th. So they got there pretty promptly. The other 4 boats that were very heavily loaded were really, too heavily loaded to make this trip. They were, the water was right up at the gunnels. Water was virtually coming in. So they decided those 4 boats were going to go to shore according to the original plan, band together and then make go overland down to Saint Louis. Now, what they found when they got ashore, and they went ashore at various places. They were a little scattered, but they went ashore between July 6th and 8th. They found that the locals, the nomadic tribes, were pretty educated. They knew about what was going on in Europe. They were on top of things, and the English, while they were in the colony, had made arrangements with them to help them rescue any stranded sailors. So rather than being captured and sold into slavery or anything, everybody who got ashore was helped out. Now they still had an arduous march, and this is off the coast of Mauritania in West Africa, and it's the Sahara Desert. This is where the desert meets the sea. So this is not, walking through the orchards. This is a tough trip, and some people died, but most of them walked and arrived in Saint Louis about 2 weeks later. So that was a long, tough trip. Meanwhile, on the raft, things broke down pretty quickly. So they started out with 150, and once they realized they were abandoned, there was a lot of despair. There was almost immediately battles over the rations. There were groups forming. The soldiers were fighting against the naval officers and the civilians. And the soldiers here, by the way, this is not your Green Berets. These are guys who have been pressed out of the prisons in order to be the expeditionary force in a colony on the coast of Africa. So they weren't the cream of the crop. So there was just a breakdown of any kind of discipline and order. They started out with 150 people on July 5th. By the next day, just with the waves knocking people off the raft overnight because the wind came up and the waves were pummeling it, they were down to 130 on the second day. By the 3rd day, July 7th, they were down from 130 to 60. And again, not a lot of provisions. So early on, uh, there was cannibalism. So what's another thing that'll get you in the history books forever is cannibalism. Is people realize that they're abandoned on this raft, and people were dead, and the only way the others were going to survive. So there was that. By day 4, they were down from 60 to 50. By day 5, they were down from 50 to 30. So in just 5 days, they were down from the original 150 to just 30 people still alive. And just despair, just total, what's going to happen to us. On day 7, July 11th, they went down to 15 from 30. And what happened there is one died, 2 were killed for stealing what little there was of provisions. And then the other 15 decided that 12 of their compatriots, who were now their friends, were in such bad shape that they wouldn't survive. So there was a mercy killing of those 12. They were their friends, so they did not eat those bodies, but they were now down to 15. And there was then another week of just drifting and surviving, and of course not expecting ever to be rescued. And then at 15 days, purely by accident, they were found. And what had happened was the governor, Schmalz, had, when he got to the colony, and then when the Argus, remember the Argus, showed up nice and safe, they sent the Argus up the coast to try to send float provisions ashore to the people who had gone ashore, and to go up to the wreck to rescue whatever they could of provisions on the wreck. They were not sent out to look for the raft. I think by this point, Schmalz knew that this was a problem. The whole thing of the raft was not a good thing, and he would just assume nobody found out about it, or it just didn't, there wasn't too much to show. But the winds there tend to come down the coast from the north. So to sail from south to north, you have to tack back and forth out to sea. And on one of their tacks out to sea, the Argus found the Medusa, found the raft, and rescued the last 15 people who were alive. Brought them back to the colony, where they were cared for by the British. The British had medical facilities. And the British, by the way, because the French fleet had arrived in such disarray, the British did not turn the colony over until later on, when things got better organized. But of the 15 there, 5 died just of their exposure soon afterwards. There was some story of somebody potentially, that said there was an attempt to murder somebody. There were attempts to suppress the story. One of the people who had been abandoned on the raft was the governor Schmalz's personal secretary. And in order to keep his position, the governor made him write a letter saying that the tow rope had broken, when that was in fact not the case. So they eventually did get a vessel back up to the Medusa. Now remember, the Medusa was in imminent danger of breaking up, which is why you had to get off right away. Well, it wasn't until 2 months later that they got a vessel up to the Medusa and found it pretty much the way they had left it. So that when waves hit, they just kind of broke over the side, but ship was not falling apart. It was still nice and strong. But of the 17 people who had been left there were only 3 left. 13 had made their own makeshift raft. They'd kind of given up hope after all that time. They made their own raft and set off, and they were never seen again. And supposedly one poor guy set out on a chicken coop to try to get ashore, and he was also not seen again. Now, the French knew that they needed to get word back to France, because this was an obvious disaster. I mean, here's the best ship in the French Navy with this group of colonists getting shipwrecked off the coast. So they sent the Echo, went back to France, and one of the people on board the ship and on board the raft was Henry Savigny, who was a doctor. And he sailed back on the Echo on July 29th. And on the way back, he wrote an account for the Navy. He was a naval officer, so he wrote an account for the Navy, and he turned it in. He went in and turned it in, and then the next day he went in to report, and he had his head handed to him. And it turned out that somebody who got the report. There were a lot of political factions, and people had it in for the government, and they knew that it was clear that this disaster was due to incompetence and due to this appointing this incompetent guy. So it had been leaked to the press. So the story of the shipwreck was all over the next day's paper, and they blamed Savigny, and he ended up getting drummed out of the Navy. He ended up teaming with a guy named Alexandre Courreard, who was one of the geographers, and they wrote a book, The Narrative of a Voyage to Senegal in 1816, an account of the shipwreck of the Medusa, the sufferings of the crew, and the various occurrences on board the raft, et cetera, in the desert. And if that's not interesting enough, if that's not a good enough story for you, to which are appended observations respecting the agriculture of the western coast of Africa. Why you needed that in this account, I am not sure, but it makes it more complete. So this book was a big seller in France, and it also got translated very quickly. I think it was 1818 into English because at that time, and maybe to some degree to this day, there was no large amount of love lost between the English and the French. So some story that reflected badly on the French would be a story that the English would love. So that was this account got carried on. Now, what about any kind of responsibility? The government realized they had to do something, but they also knew that they couldn't accept, shades of what goes on in politics all the time. They didn't want to admit that they had done anything wrong. So there was a trial of de Chaumareix, the captain. I mean, he really should have gotten death for what he did, for abandoning these people. He got 3 years imprisonment, and then let out the rest of his life. Mostly, he was not a well-liked guy in France, and he spent most of his time in his family estate here, which is not the worst of punishments. So that wraps up the first part of the story about the wreck. This is Theodore Gericault, the painter. He was born in 1791 during the Revolution, so he would have been 25 at the time of the Medusa wreck. Now, he was an aspiring artist, but he really wasn't making any big hit. He came from a well-off family, so he didn't meet the mold of the starving artist. He had no money worries. He was known as a bit of a dilettante. He was in the community, the artists that were active at that time, Delacroix and others, but he just wasn't making a name. He wasn't of their caliber. He did a lot of paintings of horses. A lot of his early work was on horses. He was known for work being either unfinished or executed in short bursts. He did some things in what was called the classical style of the day. This was large paintings of historical events, sort of putting things on the grand scale. So he did some of those things. In 1816, the same year as the Medusa wreck, he traveled to Italy, which is a thing a lot of these people did, was go and paint the ruins. He painted horses in Italy, and travel and broaden yourself. And he also left because he was involved in a small scandal at home. He had been having an affair with his aunt. He had some uncle who had a young wife, and Gericault was having an affair with his wife and had with his aunt, and had gotten her pregnant. So he was in a lot of upheaval. It was a good idea to get out of town. And then he came back to Paris in 1817, right around when the Medusa book was being published, when the story was being published. And this was still very much a big topic. So he decided he wanted to make an impact at the Paris Salon. They would periodically have these salons where they would have a competition that people would submit paintings, and they would invite artists from all over, and then people would get prizes in various categories, and the government would potentially buy works of art. And there was one announced for 1819, and he wanted to produce something for that. He just decided he was finally going to do something, and he had a novel idea. And his novel idea was that he was going to take not a historical event, but a current event. And the Medusa story was still very much a current event, that it was not far enough away to be history. So his idea was to take a current event, but to paint it in this grand classical style, which is just something that was not done. So he cast around for a topic. And originally his topic was not the Medusa. Another thing that was in the papers those days that was a big deal was the murder of a regional politician named Fualdès. And this is a sketch by Gericault when he was exploring this idea. And he was exploring the idea of the murder of of this politician. So, you know, we almost didn't have a Raft of the Medusa. We almost had a murder of Fualdès, and the painting wouldn't have happened. Again, individuals make choices in order for things to turn out the way they are. But eventually, Gericault decided that his topic would be the Medusa. And he started doing sketches and ideas. So he moved on to that in early 1818. Now he knew Savigny and Couriard, the guys who wrote the book. These people were all, this is the artists, the counterculture circle. These guys knew each other. So he could talk to them, and he could talk to them about what was going on. So he decided he was going to do something about the raft. He worked on different themes. You can see this is a sketch of the fighting on the raft. You know, people dead, people falling overboard, people with swords, people, you know, holding the provisions. But the challenge was, how do you select from a sequence of episodes that particular moment that sums up the central meaning of the event? And that's really what he was going for. And he experimented with these things like he experimented with the moment of abandonment. He experimented with the fighting on the raft. He experimented with the you know, cannibalism, with people, you know, chewing at the dead, at the bodies. But he eventually homed in on and he did about 10 months of study and composition, just trying ideas, trying and working on things, painting one thing after another before he hit on what he was going to do. And that was the rescue, the scene of combined despair and hope. And you can see this is an early version. This is a very rough version of you can see hints of what it's going to eventually become. But, you know, look at the angle of the raft, look at the number of people on it, look at the size of the Argus, look at the size of the rescue vessel. You can see, oh, they see each other, you know that. But Gericault knew that he wouldn't get this done if he kept his usual lifestyle of being kind of the dilettante artist and going out to the clubs with his friends. So he got a new studio away from everybody else. He shaved his head so he wouldn't go out. He had the Medusa's carpenter come into his studio and make a model of the raft. And to evoke the mood and to learn more about how to paint this, he went out on boats, and he went out on boats in bad weather, all kinds of weather, to get the feel for what it's like to be out on the water so he could paint it. And he didn't have experience of the seamier side of life and of death, so he went to the local hospital and he got severed heads, and he put them in a studio and painted them and let them decay so he could paint those, and severed arms and legs. So he just surrounded himself and immersed himself in this, you know, to do this. But he also he painted his painting for the eventual thing was from live models. And one of the models was a person who was a well-known artist model in the day, a person named Joseph. And I was in California in just pre-February of this year, right, just before things cratered. And I was at the Getty Museum, and I was just walking around, and I found this painting at the Getty, this painting of Joseph. This is by Gericault. This is one of his just portrait studies, again, part of his studies for the Medusa. And the painting moved along to different stages, you know, different levels of working the idea. And here's a later stage. And here's this figure here, this now prominent figure that wasn't in the earlier versions, standing up and waving something. That is Joseph. And another thing you can see, a lot of this part of the scene is similar, but notice that the ship has gotten much smaller. It's further away compared to what it had been. You know, there's no prominent figure waving there, and the ship is close, ship's receding. So he was homing in on his idea. Once he'd finished his 10 months of studying compositions, took 8 months of painting, going through more advanced studies, and then finally getting to the final version. And a couple areas I just want to point out, because I'm going to show you the final next, is this area, where I'm moving my cursor in this area. And when we get to the final, a couple things are different. This is very reminiscent of the earlier study with the figures on the raft, Joseph here waving, but there's a figure added here and a figure added here, two dead bodies. And what happened is that when Gericault actually took this painting, which was gigantic, out of the studio and was able to look at it at more of a remove, he didn't like the balance. And these two figures were added after the painting was, essentially after the painting is done. And I think one of them is actually Eugene Delacroix, who was alive at the time, of course. So on this raft, there are 20 figures on the raft, 50 of them alive. And now look at the Argus. So can you see, if you see where the cursor is, it's a dot. And that's just genius, because now compared to the earlier versions, you know that the people on the raft can see the ship, and you know the ship can't see them. They're too small a target. So it's this almost hope, So that's just, this moment that he captured. So it's a gigantic painting. It's 23 feet wide by 16 feet high. I mean, this is a gigantic, gigantic painting. And when it went into the Paris Salon, it was being judged with the history paintings. There was no category for current events. And it was the largest easel painting at the Salon. And Gericault had a choice of where he would have it hung, and he made a mistake. He had it hung up high, which just put it away from the viewer. So it was big, but it was far away. If you go to the Louvre now, should you be able to, the painting is right at ground level. And I was able to get there at one point, and it's just, you're there. I mean, this gigantic, gigantic painting is right in front of you. And just to give you a feel for how big this painting is, I wanted to put something in it as a reference to get a feel for that. So I decided I would take a standard issue, bell curve, standard human being, Rob Gronkowski. I know that I should change his uniform at this point. So he's 6'6", 265 pounds. He's not a small person. If you were to put him scaled into the Medusa painting, there he is. So that is a big, big painting. And it is, if you ever get a chance to go to Paris, hopefully, go see it. You'll know now the story and have a new appreciation for it. But the story has just continued. It's just a story that has endured, because of the elements of the art history, but also of the horror of the event itself. And the thing that I first read when I got involved in this project was this book, Death Raft, by Alexander McKee, who was a marine historian. And once I was looking in a newspaper and I saw an advertisement for a play named Raft of the Medusa, and I was very intrigued. Well, it turned out the play had nothing to do with this. The play was about the HIV/AIDS crisis. It was right back in when that was a big thing, and they chose that title because it was felt to symbolize man's inhumanity to man. The raft had just, what had gone on there, this abandonment, this people being left to their own devices, was the metaphor for what was happening to the people with HIV/AIDS back then. So that's the end of part 2, the painting. Okay, part 3 is our expedition to go find this in 1980. And again, this, it takes people. Things like this don't just happen out of nowhere. It takes people to make something happen. And the person probably most responsible for this thing getting underway is this older gentleman here, Professor Theodore Gericault. He was 78 at the time of this picture, and he was very well known in Africa. He was a French scientist, but he'd spent his whole career in Africa exploring the desert, the natural history, the geography. He knew all the heads of state. He was very well connected, very well respected. And he felt that, okay, now was the time that the political and whatever conditions were right, that you could pull this off. And he wanted, he was aware of the Medusa and the story, and he wanted this to happen. But he was not a marine archaeologist, a marine person, and he was also older. So he enlisted this guy, this tall, skinny guy, Jean-Yves Belot. Jean-Yves was a young French marine archaeologist who had been getting a lot of press. He'd been doing some very interesting projects. He had been getting published a lot, both in popular and scientific literature. So Jean-Yves became the director of this project. And it was through Jean-Yves that, yes, that is me. Those of you who know me as gray with much shorter hair, that is me at an earlier time. It was through Jean-Yves that I got involved. So I had been working in various marine archaeology projects, small scale sorts of things, but involved in surveying work. I was more on the technical side of things. And I had made a program back, in the 78, 79, based on the early, TI programmable calculators that had that little memory strip you'd feed through. So I'd written a program that you could use that helped you map things using surveyor transits. So if you set them up on known points, you got two angles. If you knew those points and you knew the angles, you could calculate the XY coordinates. And I'd done that for helping map boats during surveys, but Jean-Yves wanted a way to do precise mapping out on a reef in Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, where he was going to be working on a wreck. I met him at an underwater archaeology conference. He was introduced to me by somebody who we both knew. I gave him the program for the calculator, and then over the ensuing year or so, he was periodically sending me these articles from French magazines where he was talking about his project and mentioned the contribution of the stuff I had done and showed them surveying. So he's just sending me these things. And then one day he sends me a letter and he starts describing this new project he's gotten involved with, this Medusa. And he wrote a bunch of questions and he was asking for advice on how to find it. He was talking, how are you going to position yourself out at sea? Are you going to use radar? Are you going to do this or that? And I went out and I found that the book that I read to get educated, I found that book I showed you, the Death Raft. This is what I read. And I read about the shipwreck and I said, okay, I wrote him back and I said, based on this, here's what I think you should do. And I was just giving him some advice. And the next thing you know, he wrote back and he said, how'd you like to be the technical director? And, I was young and able to do that. So I figured out, why not? What better to do than go off and find a shipwreck off the coast of Africa. So that's how I got involved. One of the things I loved about Jean-Yves' letter, by the way, if you ever, work with other languages, people often have trouble with pronouns. So the phrase I always remember from his letter was when he was describing the cannibalism, he said, they killed themselves and ate the bodies. Wonderful. Now, the fourth guy here, who I have not mentioned yet, this is Edmond de Rocher, 86 years old. He was a Medusa nut. I mean, he was just totally wrapped up in this. He was a direct descendant of the youngest survivor of the shipwreck. Not somebody who had been on the raft, but there was a family that had been on there, and there was a 5-year-old girl who was part of the group that went ashore and made it overland. He was descended from that little girl, and he had made it this life's mission to plan and where is the Medusa and to study the history. And when he found out who I was and that I was the technical director, he came over me. We were down here in Rochefort working on preparing the boats, some boats for the project, and he went rooting in his pockets and he pulled out an old envelope and he wrote something down and he hands it to me and it's coordinates, latitude and longitude. And he says, don't listen to anybody else. This is where it is. This is where the ship is. So I said, okay, I'll take this. And I put it in my pocket. And he wanted to go on this project in the worst way, but he was 86 years old and this was just not happening. So that's sort of, the project and part of how it came to be, but obviously you need more people and you need money. So how do you fund it? Well, they got French television involved, gave some support, Télévision Française, TF1, and this is a Roch Pescadère, who was the ex-military guy, but he was a cameraman and he was an underwater cinematographer for TF1. There's Jean-Yves over here. This is a guy named Franck Joubelin, who's a very skilled diver, expedition guy. So, there's various external support like this for the project. And of course, you form an organization and you sell t-shirts to everybody. So here's the raft. And this is This is our group. This is the acronym for the Groupe de Recherche, Identification and Exploration de l'Épave de la Meduse, the group for the exploration, for searching for and excavating the Medusa. So you'd make these T-shirts and go around and give talks and try to raise money from people and companies. But also you do a lot of research, because when you go out to find a lot of shipwreck, there's always doubters. There's wrecks everywhere. So you found some old wood, you found some glass, you found some bottles. Is that the right ship, or you just find something else? So you need to know what you're looking for so that you can know definitively what you found. So you want to do all that background research for the kind of things you'd find. Now, if you want to know what the Medusa would have been like, we're back now to that picture that was to the ship that was in that drawing that I showed you much earlier on of a vessel under sail, the USS Constitution. And if you want to know what the Medusa would have been like, go see the Constitution. They were both built within years of each other. They're both 44-gun frigates. And so a lot of the shipbuilding knowledge and technology would have been in common. Now, the Constitution was bigger, but still very similarly rigged and similar size, same number of guns, so the same idea. So you get an idea of the physical things that are on the ship that are the kind of things you might find. And you look at the documents, and here's the actual sailing document for the Medusa. This is the official French Navy document. Here's the detail at the top. It says, here's the frigate, the Roi, the King's frigate, the Medusa, 44 guns, going to Senegal under the command of de Chaumareix. And notice it says, here's the battery, 14 cannon. Remember, we said they only took 14 guns because they needed more space for the people on board. So this is the document for the voyage. And then you want to say, okay, what kind of anchors would they have carried at that time? Because using the technology, which I'll describe to you in a little bit, a very likely kind of thing you're going to find are anchors. Because first of all, you're going to put them out there to try to get the ship moved. And secondly, they're going to give a signal to the search instruments that you're using. But you do things even as arcane as what's the thickness of the glass in the captain's cabin. Remember, this is a Navy vessel, so it's built to specifications. All the purchase documents, all the documentation on where they got things, what they specified, how they want it built, all these things can be found. So you want to know as much as you can, and this is the kind of thing that Jean-Yves and the archaeologists on the team would focus on is knowing what you're going to find. But when you're doing this research, a nice thing to find would be something that says, here is the position of the Medusa on the Arguin Bank. That's a nice piece of information. Well, where did this come from? So the French in 1817, about 9 months after the wreck of the Medusa, and knowing how badly mapped the coast was, the French sent out an expedition. It was called Rosson-Givry, named for the captain and the chief cartographer. They were sent out to go use the chronometers to map the coast. Where the Medusa was, to get better maps. And while they were down there, 9 months after the wreck, remember they left the Medusa because it was going to break up at any minute? So one day they're out there and they see something sticking up from miles away. And they go over to find out what it is, and it was the Medusa, still sticking up out of the water 9 months later. So they mapped the position. You can see here's deep water, and here we're getting up on the bank, and here's the Medusa, which would have sailed in like this. And it actually has the position. Here's the latitude and the longitude. Now, feel free to copy that down. If you go to that position, you're going to be out in the middle of nowhere. You're not going to be at the shipwreck because this is 1817. The French do not love the English. Our latitude system is based on the prime meridian, which is 0 degrees that goes through Greenwich, England. Well, the French were having none of that. This position is based on a prime meridian that goes through Paris. So you can make the correction, but that's not where the ship is, right there. So when I got involved, so I got this invitation to participate, and of course now I'm more on the technical side, so I try to do the technical things. Nowadays you can use Google Earth. I mean, a lot of the things I'm going to say are trivial now, but were not trivial back then. But you could write in for getting satellite photographs, and here's a satellite photograph of that part of the coast. The Arguin Bank. There's the bright white that you see here are clouds, but the pale underneath is sand. You're actually seeing through the water into the shallow water. So this just gives a general overview of what that area of the world looks like that you're trying to go to. And then of course I went and I went to the chart office and I got the nautical chart for that area. And it was the first time in all the things I had done that the chart was essentially blank. This was uncharted water, and there was no information. And that's a little facetious. Here's a picture of the actual U.S. chart, best chart there was for that area. It is blank. It's just blank. Here's the deeper water off, getting into deeper water off the bank. Here it says this is just shallow, and there's no contour lines. There's no depths. Uncharted waters. Now you'll see 4 sets of initials on there. Whoops. 4 sets of initials on there. And these were different estimates that we were given of where the Medusa would be. And it's nice that they're close together. So RG, that's the Rossingivri. If you take the latitude and longitude and you convert it to the prime meridian of Greenwich, that puts it there. S stands for CHOAM. That's for the acronym for the French Hydrographic Service. They did a study for us just in advance of the project, and they came up with their best estimate of where the wreck would be. The B is for a guy named Jean Bourgoin. Now, Jean Bourgoin he was in the French Hydrographic Service. He had been on the charting expedition. So the French had been out there on a charting expedition, and he had been on that, and this was his estimate that he gave us. And the R is the coordinates that were scrawled on the back of that envelope from Edmond de Rocher. So now, of course, we got a contest going to see who's going to be closest to the position of the Medusa. Now, we did get access to these French unpublished charts where they had taken soundings. They had done some mapping of this a few years before our project, and they gave us those. And here you see this green area on the side. That's the deeper water. Then you're getting into the shallower and the shallower. When you get to this white with the red lines, you're less than 6 feet deep. 2 meters. So very, very shallow. And this is the general area we're going to be working in. So how do you find something? How do you look for something underwater? How do you find something? I mean,
Charles, how big is it? How big is that area?
In this drawing, in this picture? I don't know. I'd have to look into it. Let's say maybe, I don't know, half mile high. I'm not sure. So I'm not going to answer. So how do you look for something? If this were easy, it would have been done. We were not the first people to ever go out there and look for it. We know that a French ambassador had once gone out there. We know that people had flown over in planes looking for it. So if it was going to be something trivial to just go out there and find it, it would have been found. So you need a way to work and conduct a good scientific search out there in this uncharted water in a pretty remote area of the world. And one of the things you want a nice boat to work off of, because you're not working off shore. And I knew a guy who was very wealthy, been involved in marine archaeology, loved marine archaeology, so he was a supporter of many projects. He was a former ambassador to Jamaica under Nixon, and he owned this vessel called Morning Watch. And it was a wonderful thing. If you were below decks and in the cabin, this was a luxury yacht. But as soon as you went out on the aft deck, this was a workboat with a nice rugged deck and cranes for lifting and compressors. So I did one project, not on he had a second Morning Watch later on, and did a project on that. And it was pretty nice when you went, from the work area and you went to the nice luxury area inside. Anyway, I went to him and I told him about this project, and he said he was willing to do it. So he would give the ship to the project, for an indefinite period of time, take it across the ocean, use it as the base for $50,000, which is a very reasonable amount of money. So Jean-Yves took there was a little brochure on the boat, and Jean-Yves took this around, and he went to IBM. He said, "Hey, IBM, how'd you like to get behind this project? We'll paint your name on the side of the boat." IBM didn't bite, so he went to, "Hey, Hewlett-Packard, how'd you like to get your name on the side of this boat and support this project?" And they didn't bite. So nobody bid. Nobody bid on coming up with $50,000 for this beautiful boat. So in the end, the project was done on 4 sailboats that Jean-Yves dug up in the harbors of France. So not the most not the most sophisticated, and the project crew were spread out among the boats, and now you've not only got the project crew, but all the crew of the boats that you've got to support. So it was a bit of a mess. Now, how do you find something out on the ocean? And this is from an old ad back from those times of, for some sort of navigation system. And this is a silly thing now. If I were speaking to you at our normal meeting place in Bedford, here we are. Boom, GPS. You know where you are all the time. It's trivial, anywhere in the world. But back then, this technology did not exist. In 1980, there was a thing called the transit satellite system, which was a precursor to the GPS. This is part of the learning curve to getting to this, to GPS. And what this was a network of satellites that would go around the Earth in a polar orbit. And they weren't there all the time. So you would get these tables that you would say, okay, if I'm here, there's going to be a satellite coming up over there at a reasonable thing, and it's got to be the right elevation above the horizon in order to get the data. And in order to get the data that the satellite was sending down and turn it into a position, you have to be on a north-south course for 20 minutes. So you'd know when the satellite was coming, and then you'd say, okay, let me get on this course and hope that your equipment would get the reading and come up with a position that was, not really super accurate. I mean, you're not going to run a survey on it because you could easily go a day with getting no positions. But if you want to generally position yourself in a large open area of ocean, this was kind of what your only option was at that time. For the local positioning, because if you're going to run a boat back and forth, the idea is you're going to run a search grid with detection equipment to try to find the ship. The idea, we got this advanced electronic navigation system from a company in France, and you can see the antenna off on. The idea was to put this on small boats, battery powered, and use these to guide the navigation of the vessels. Now, you need a way to actually detect the ship. Again, you're not going to just see it. And it's shallow water. It had 160 something years to get broken up, so there's not going to be things sticking up. So you need a way to detect it. Now, the most likely thing you're going to find are iron things like the cannon, and you do that with a thing called a magnetometer. It's an instrument that detects the Earth's magnetic field. And there were different versions at that time, and the typical commercial thing that was out there in the market would have a bottle of water, essentially, and you'd magnetize it. So you'd line up all the you put a field around it, line them all up, and then you'd measure the precession as they went back to randomness, and that told you what the strength of the field was. And those would cycle about once a second, and they had decent accuracy. The French Atomic Energy Agency, this couple, Monsieur and Madame Lemercier, had developed this really fancy version of this magnetometer that had 10 times more accuracy and read 100 times as fast. And they agreed to come along on the project. This is not either of them, this is their assistant. And this would be the tool, the primary tool for finding the wreck. Now, the way this works is the Earth has a magnetic field. And you can measure that strength. Well, if you put an object like an anchor, an iron anchor, in the field, it causes a local perturbation. It itself gets magnetized, becomes what's called a dipole because of the field imposed on it. And it creates its own little north-south pole, so that if you run across it with the detector, you'll get some distinctive bumps on your reading. So instead of getting a flat reading, all of a sudden you get these bumps, and you can tell which way things are oriented by these bumps. So that was a very common tool for finding anything where you didn't expect anything to be sticking up, obvious to find, but you needed to find iron. So there's a lot of preparation for this. There was a lot of time in France. This is shot in the back patio at Jean-Yves' parents' house in the countryside of France, outside of Paris, with the team discussing planning. I spent a lot of time up in the attic of that house. HP donated what they say, this was what they called a programmable calculator. This was 1980. There were no personal computers back then. This was one of the most advanced things out there. And a plotter. And this was going to be what we were going to connect to the navigation system and guide the survey. So I spent a lot of time up in this attic writing software for that to run the search grids. But we also were doing PR. Jean-Yves was always trying to raise money. So one day we had an event coming up down at Le Mans, and I got access to a digitizer at the Hewlett Packard office. And I went over there, and we digitized this thing that says, "Welcome to Mauritania." Then at the bottom it says on the trail of the naval frigate Medusa and the ship, and then this Arabic. And what we did is we digitized this all so that you tell the plotter go, and you stick a piece of paper in it, and the pen would just go mad and do this, and then we'd hand these out to people and then hope they would give us money. And to get the Arabic, supposedly this would say the same thing in Arabic, but Jean-Yves, literally just before I'm about to go off to HP to do this, he goes running down to the local butcher and says, "Hey, I've got this stuff. Can you write this in Arabic?" And that's what I used for the digitizing. And it wasn't until we got to Mauritania that I knew that this said the right thing, and it didn't say, buy your fresh meat at Ahmed's, butchery. So, we did this, a lot of fundraising, and now you got to feed everybody. So there were companies that donated food. So you can see all these cans, these cases and cases of canned food. And this is choucroute and cassoulet. If you go to a good restaurant, these are kind of French country dishes. They're nice, rich, they're delicious. But when they're canned like this, the loose translation would be sauerkraut and beanie weenies. And that was the main expedition fare other than what we could catch. And of course, if you're doing something like this, there are late nights. Here's, trying to get geared down to the port to be transported on the vessels, and the tire exploding on the trailer. But eventually, you got to do it. Everything comes together, and you end up in Africa. And this was really an incredible experience for me. I had never been to Africa, so it was just a very remote place. And here's the setting. So Mauritania is on the west coast, right at the bulge of Africa, out into the ocean. Senegal, Saint Louis, is just down below to the south. This area above it, above the yellow line, is the Western Sahara. Now, the Western Sahara is an area that was claimed by multiple people. So there were claims by Mauritania, there were claims by Morocco, and then there were claims by local people, the Polisario Liberation Front. And they had been at war for years. And Mauritania, one of the big parts of its economy is it has iron mines in the interior that are connected to the coast, which is out here at the port city of Nouadhibou, just by Cap Blanc, by railroad lines. Well, if you've got railroad lines running through miles and miles and miles of desert, it was just too easy for the Polisario to keep going in there and blowing up the railroad lines and hurting the economy. So Mauritania finally just dropped out of the war the year before we were there. So this is, what we're seeing here. This is the Sahara Desert. This is not, lush tropical jungle. This is the Sahara Desert meeting the ocean. So it's a beautiful, exotic place. And we were doing work on land, setting up navigation systems, doing calibrations, getting everything working once we got there. But we were advised, don't leave the beaten path. Don't go wandering around off into the desert, because no one could quite remember where they had left the landmines. This peninsula, you can see that the line between Mauritania and Western Sahara goes right down the peninsula to Cap Blanc. The year before we were there, this had been an area of warfare. So exotic, but you had to kind of watch out where you are. It was a great inspirational place. This was our base for where we were based out of this port city of Nouadhibou. And it was a good place to get inspiration. All you had to do was walk down to the harbor, and shipwrecks would be inspiring. Or if you got bored looking at shipwrecks in the harbor, you could just go around the corner and look at the airplane wreck. Somebody got the beacon was off one night, and a plane full of people coming in for the fishing fleets kind of wrecked. And you take advantage of local transport to help your project along. And then there's the problem of actually getting from the port to the wreck. So here's Nouadhibou up here. The Medusa site, here are those positions, the estimated positions, uncharted water, and that's about 100 miles. I mean, that's a long trip. So the local knowledge that you get from the fishermen was leave the port, go at 168 degrees, follow a compass course of 168 degrees until you get to the G. Now, what's the G? Of course, it's another shipwreck. It's a fishing vessel named the Georgios that is sunk, and it was now sitting there used as a navigational marker. So once you get to the Georgios, you can then turn south, and then you can safely turn west to get to the work area. So we did this, but then one of the times we were going down to the site, it was like, well, this is uncharted water. I mean, what do they know? Do they really know everything? So we tried to take a shortcut. Well, you see these three ovals here are places where our sailboat that we're trying to get to the site was bumping on the bottom, and we were worried about running aground and devouring each other. And then these two vertical lines are lines of breakers. So this was like, okay, let's just follow the rules the next time. Let's not do our own exploring and trust the folks. So we get out finally to the site. And of course, when you do projects like this, you go to a place like Mauritania and say, we're here to do this historical thing, and we just want to find this ship because of its important history. Well, people are like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I bet there's gold there. So they want to make sure you're not doing anything nefarious. So the Mauritanian Navy sent a patrol boat along with us just to be helpful. This was the Tichet, was the name of the boat. And right away, as soon as we got to the site, so what we did is we got a fix from the transit navigational system, and we were just getting things organized. And while we were doing that, the magnetometer crew from the French Atomic Energy Agency was on this boat, which was the smallest of our 4 sailboats. And they were just tooling around, just practicing with the magnetometer, just to get it tuned up and get it working. And within an hour, they were getting signals. So this is one of the rare cases where the shipwreck is pretty much under the X. When you do the history, you get an idea where you want to look, and the ship was actually there. And right away, put in divers and found things like this, a copper spike sticking out of the bottom. Cannon piled up. Remember, they piled up the 14 cannons to try to tip the vessel? Pile of cannons on the bottom. So we're pretty sure right away that we found the Medusa, but that doesn't mean that you're done. You've still got to do the science work. You've got to do the mapping. So the archaeology is careful mapping of the site. What's the distribution of anything? And it was a strange place to work. I mean, you see how murky it is. It's very shallow water. It's only probably 10, 15 feet deep there. But it's a lot like New England. There's a lot of suspended matter. You've got a lot of coastal currents. You've got all the sand there. So now the divers are going off, no land in sight and just disappearing into the murk. And it's a rich area. It's a very rich, there's a nutrient upwelling from the ocean there. There's a very active fishing fleet off the coast there. But it also means there's a very vibrant ecosystem. So, we would fish off the boats, and then right where we're working here is catching a hammerhead shark. So there's plenty of things in the water there. And, we did this project in December of 1980. Well, you don't just pick any old time to do this, right? What you do is you say, what's the best time of year for the weather? When can you get the most work done? And everybody said for that part of the world, that's the right time. So that's what we did. Well, we get there, and of course, we're out on the site, and I think maybe it was the second day, and we're, just calm. Everything was fine, light winds, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, it's like a freight train coming through. The wind just went from virtually nothing to like 30 knots, coming straight out of the north. And it was going over shallow water. So if you've got a wind blowing over 100 miles of shallow water, you don't get big waves, but you get just a nasty, nasty chop, nasty steep chop. And the boats are bucking around. And on that first night, one of the 4 vessels lost their anchor. It's not that the anchor got lost. The anchor windlass, the thing where the anchor connects to the boat, cracked in half, and the anchor went over the side. They had to go offshore and ride out the night offshore to be safe. And then we actually used the magnetometer the next day to find their lost anchor. So this caused us occasionally to have to run back up to Nouadhibou, get things fixed up, and then head back down to the site. But the work would continue, and you look to find things that can help you specifically identify and date the vessel, things like pottery fragments. It's known what the periods of these things are. Spikes, these are this, a spike that would have been used in the construction, and you can see there's an FR on it, and that's a foundry mark. And you say, okay, we know that that's where the Medusa, that's the foundry that the Medusa got its spikes from. And you recover the cannon. The cannons often have markings on them that let you do the identification. So those were, some of those were recovered. It was not a major excavation. It was really just enough, an assortment of things. to do a definitive identification and to mount an exhibition at the French Maritime Museum in Paris. That was, it was successful. It was successful fairly quickly. Now, what about the position? So we can't leave this without whoever was closest. So here's the view of the site, and you can see this, where I'm putting my cursor, that's where the Medusa sailed in. Remember I said they sailed into a cul-de-sac? They had to turn around to get back the way they came in. That's where they'd come in. And then when they turned around, they ended up getting themselves stuck here at the M. So here's the Chaume and the Rosselin Givry are off to the left here. Here's Jean Bourgoin, who's pretty close. And there's the position on the back of the envelope. On Edmond de Rocher was the closest. So it was nice to be able to get that word back to him. So that's it. That's the story of the Medusa, and the Medusa shipwreck, and the painting, and the expedition to find it. And if you're still there, thank you for listening.